So we're going to make a surgical scrub hat today. In order to make a hat, you need two pattern pieces. The first one is the piece for the circle. It takes a 20-inch circle of fabric to make a hat, so you need a pattern piece to make a 20-inch circle. There's two ways to do this. One, my first pattern, I just cut a half a circle like this, and then you put it on the fold and cut around it. However, to do less work, I made a quarter circle, and then when you put this piece on, you have to have two folds. Either way works just fine. To make this piece, take a string and put it in the center, tie it around a pencil, and your string should be 10 inches long. And then if you just draw the circle, it will be 10 inches on each side, so a 20-inch circle. So whichever is easier for you, you can use a half-inch or half circle pattern or a quarter circle pattern. In order to make the brim, we have another piece, and this piece you're going to have to draw by hand, and the piece is 15 inches long and 3 inches wide. So what I did was measure 15 inches long and 3 inches wide, and then it's kind of a gradual curve until you get to the ends, and each end is a half an inch wide. So it should go from half an inch to 3 inches and then back to half an inch with a total length of 15 inches. This particular piece also is going to be on a fold. So I just drew a little thing here to remind me to put it on a fold. All right, so now we have our pieces cut. I like to use the quarter circle piece, and to do that, here's my piece of fabric. Now, I like wild hats, so I tend to have a bright colored print and then a contrasting print. Something with high contrast is my favorite, but I've seen a lot of hats with the same fabric used for the brim. In this case, I'm going to use a light green polka dot for the brim. So, in order to make the circle, this is folded twice. A half a yard of fabric is close to 20 yards. It'll be just a little bit short, but it works just fine, and so does a fat quarter. In order to make the circle, this piece is actually folded, and it's going to make two hats. So I leave it folded in half. Here are the two selvages, and then I fold it in half again. Here's the first fold, the regular fold, and then I fold it in half this way, and then I fold it in half again, like that. So now I have two folds, one here and one here. And then I pick up my piece of pattern and I put it on here, and you can see this is a half yard piece of fabric. So it's not quite 20 inches. They gave me just a tiny bit extra at the fabric store, but you can tell it'll be about an inch short if it's a true half yard, about 2 inches short if it's a true half yard fabric, but it will work just fine. A half yard is 18 inches instead of 20 inches, but it works okay. So if you want more than 20 inches, you have to go up to 5/8 of a yard. So then I just put my pattern piece on, and I don't even usually pin it. I just kind of hold it and cut right around it. So here is my fabric, and if I unfold it, I have a circle, and I actually have two circles because it was doubled, so I can make two hats out of half a yard. So to make the brim, here's my next piece. And this is my contrasting color. And in this case, I'm using something that has a print that is regular on it. So I've already taken it to my iron and folded it. And you want to fold it with a 3-inch double width. And in this case, I ironed it so that it follows exactly the dots. So when I put this down, this one I usually do pin. Because it does shift a little bit and you're actually cutting a much smaller piece. So if you have a piece that's directional, if it has words or a direction on the print, you're going to need to be a little more careful as you sew the brim on. And in this case, if you have stripes or a pattern, make sure you iron it straight so that when you cut your brim, it's regular and even. This is the first part of the hat you'll see, so it'll be obvious if it's crooked. And we just cut this piece out. like that. So now we have our circle and our brim, just like that. I usually put interfacing on the brim, and the place I put the interfacing is on the inside of the brim. So when I get my piece of interfacing, I'll just iron it to the bottom side. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine. So next I have my circle, and what I'm going to do is mark the side edges. So I'm going to fold it in half, and in this case I know this is top and bottom because they're a little bit flat because I didn't have quite 20 inches of fabric. So I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to put a pin on each side. These are the exact 90-degree sides where your brim is going to end on each side. And then I will often fold it in half and pin the exact center of the front and back, because we're going to need to center the brim and the elastic in the back. So once I have that pin in place, I'm going to put a pin on each side, just like that. So I know where my front and back is. Again, if your fabric is directional, make sure that you have the front and back straight, because next thing we're going to do is finish the back edge. To do that, I have my sides, and I'm going to serge, in this case, from the side all the way around the back to the other side, leaving the front unserged. So make sure your direction is correct. If you don't have a serger, you could probably zigzag this. This is going to be an exposed edge, so you want to finish it in some way or other, because this hat's probably going to get washed a lot of times. So I have 180 degrees of my circle finished. Then I'm going to take my top, and I've put interfacing on the bottom side, and I usually cut my interfacing just a little smaller, although you don't have to. I'm going to serge the edge of the interface side, because that's going to be the only exposed edge of the brim. So here's our 20-inch circle. The back is finished, the front is unfinished, and the pin is exactly in the center in the front. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my brim piece and fold it in half. I have the bottom finished and the top unfinished, and what I want is to get a pin in the unfinished side right exactly in the center. So if I fold it in half, then I just put my pin right here in the center. Now I'm going to take and put the right side of the unfinished side of the brim to the right side of the circle. And here my pins line up exactly. And I'm going to open the brim piece and pin this side to the circle. Just like that. Then I'm going to take each corner and bring it to the very edge of where my circle's finished. And I'm going to pin that down on each side so that the entire front half is going to be sewn to the brim when I'm finished. And I tend to overlap them a little bit, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. Then you have to work this fabric into this length. You can do that one of two ways. You can gather it or you can pleat it. I tend to like to pleat it because it's pretty fast. I don't particularly love gathering, and the way I gather it is 2 folds right in the center. You can do them either direction toward each other or away from each other, but you'll have 2 folds that meet here, and then 3 smaller folds on each side toward the edge. So I have my first 2 folds here. And then as I go across, I tend to make my folds a little bit smaller as I go across from the center toward the edge, but you can make them really any distance or any length you want. And the nice thing about hats is they're pretty forgiving. There's no exact length you have to make it. And in this case, I'm just going to pull that a little bit so I have a little bit, and this last fold is going to be pretty small. And it's just kind of a style thing. You can make them any size you want. And then this last one will take up whatever's left. If you want it to be more, make your other two folds a little bit smaller. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. 3 folds between the center and the edge. You could probably make it 2 folds, however you want to do it. All right, and now we're going to sew the brim to the circle. All right, so we're going to sew the brim down, and usually I make about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is about the edge of my machine foot. Again, hats are forgiving, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I just sew all along. My machine walks over pins. If yours doesn't, you'll have to remove the pins. All right, and you want your seam to end about in the exact center of the width of the brim, right where the fold is. All right, take our pins out, and then we're going to turn it. And I have a few little areas where the black is over the light green. This is such a light color, I'm going to trim those off because it will show through underneath the brim, so will these extra threads. So if you're using a light colored brim and a dark colored background or circle, you're probably going to want to trim it just to be safe. And then we're going to turn it inside out or right side out and tug on that. You can iron this. I don't usually iron it. I just kind of pull on it nice and tight. And then your front side has your pleats in it. And the back side, we're going to sew the back of the brim down over the raw edge so that everything is finished inside except for this edge, which is finished by either zigzag or serging it. And then as I do, I'm going to lay it down, make sure my seam is tucked under this direction, and pin the brim in place. So tug it and make sure it's flat and smooth, and then pin it down, and you're ready to sew it down. And we'll do that on both sides. So then once we have it pinned down, I turn mine over and I put my seam allowance just a little tiny bit. You're really top stitching this. So just inside the line where the brim and the circle are sewn together. Just stretch it a little bit, make sure that's smooth and flat. And you'll have a small seam allowance or seam there. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Hats are forgiving. And pull it over. And our brim is on. So our brim is on. Next, we're going to take the edges of the brim, the points, and line them up. And then, just like this, I'm going to put a pin right in the center of the back. We pinned it before, but I took the pin out to finish it. You could have put it back in then, but I like to put it back in there now that the brim is on. And then that pin's in the center back. I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to sew 2 inches of little short hem, just like a 1/4 inch hem, 2 inches on either side of this pin. You can kind of eyeball it or estimate, it's okay. This is a little hem where there's going to be no elastic in the back of the hat. So we've got our little seam here, and during the camera stop I changed the thread. I like my thread to match wherever it shows. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So the next thing we're going to do is put the elastic in, and we're going to put this elastic in sewing the casing around the elastic. So what I do is take the elastic and tuck it under right here where the brim ends. And there's just a little 1/2 inch area where it overlaps right there, and then I put a pin in like this. I like to sew my elastic in with a little zigzag stitch across there for 2 reasons. A zigzag stitch holds it better because it's under a fair bit of tension, so it holds better than a small straight stitch. And the other thing is it's going to finish this edge, which is the only remaining edge that's not covered and finished. So we're going to do a small zigzag stitch straight across, just like that. And then I'm going to put my needle down and take the pin out and change to a straight stitch. Now as I sew this down, I'm actually sewing the elastic inside the casing. So as you do this, you want to be really careful. If you get too close to your elastic, then your elastic is going to be stuck. So you have to be careful to make sure you're outside where your elastic is. I use 3/8 inch elastic. And the piece of elastic that I use is 13 inches long. And I actually just mark it on my sewing table because I make 100 hats a year or more. So get 3/8 inch, although 1/4 inch would probably work as well. And 13 inches long, tack the first end, and then sew your casing right around your elastic, just like this. So your casing ends up about 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit wider than that. There's plenty of room in there for your elastic. And these are bouffant hats, so they're full. So it doesn't matter if the casing's a little bit wider than that. There's plenty of width in this hat that it can donate. And then I'm actually going to pull that elastic tighter so that it comes out the end here, because I don't want to lose it inside there. And I just pin this little end right here, and I know where to stop because of this little seam that I sewed right here, that 4 inches at the very back in the center. Sew to here, and backspace, and half the casing's done. Then I'm going to pull as hard as I can and tighten it up, and now that elastic is in a pretty small space, and this is as much elastic as I have free. There's going to be a little bit less on this other side, so I'm going to have to pull it up sooner because it's not as long now. And again, I'm going to tuck it under this corner where the brim and the hat meet, and I'm going to put my pin in to hold it in place, and then put your small zigzag stitch on and finish that loose edge, and then needle down, change to a straight stitch, and sew your casing on this other side. You can feel your elastic, just push it up against the edge there and sew your casing. There's a little bit of a curve to this because it's a circle, so it's going to be a little bit longer on the outside than on the inside. That's okay. You can ease it in. You can make little tucks. It doesn't matter. Nobody's going to see this because it's all going to be gathered on the inside of the hat. And again, it's pretty forgiving. And I'm going to put a pin here right at the edge. Make sure my elastic is as far to the fold as I can. Stitch it, and our casing's done. Then I'm going to pull my elastic up as hard as I can so it's as long as possible back here, and then I'm going to match up my two pieces of the brim, and this tells me where the exact center of my elastic is. Next, I use a little piece of ribbon. You can use a little piece of wire, anything that's doubled, and that's how you're going to put your cord stop on. The cord stop just goes right across the top. This is my favorite cord stop to use. It's Drist. They're not super expensive, but the spring is nice and strong. So thread that through there. Nice and strong spring, and just pull it through, and then you have a nice long piece, and I just tie it to make a little knot. That way, as people can tighten and loosen with this cord stop, it won't fall off. So there we go, and we'll loosen those up, and there's a hat all done. If you happen to be using this kind of cord stop, you have to remember to put it on before you sew the elastic in on the other side. So just a word of warning, I frequently forget, which is why I like the other cord stop better. But things are a little short right now, so whatever you can find, this kind works just fine. Just make sure you thread it onto the elastic halfway through. And that's it. When I make hats for the OR, I don't put buttons on them because our masks tie. But if you're making masks for the emergency room or the ICU, you might want to put buttons on them. These buttons go right here at the edge of the brim, because then people can string the elastic for the masks around there instead of putting it around your ears, because it makes your ears really sore. So if you happen to be putting on buttons, you want a decent sized button. This one's probably a little big. It's just what I had in my grandma's button can. But you want a button big enough that the string would fit around and have enough space around it. So probably a 3/4 inch button or so. And you can pick a color that doesn't match, a color that does. This particular hat is plain because it's for my friend in the ICU who doesn't like bright colors. So any kind of color button you want, just sew it right to the edge of the brim, and then they can string their masks right around the edge of the button and hold it in place.